even are the skills needed to be an entry-level engineer? Today I'm talking about the skills that I used in my first job in tech after graduating a coding boot camp. I've been working as a software engineer for over 1 year at this point, but I was actually hired on to my company in a different role. It was essentially engineer support. My company has a lot of apps that we build and then use internally. If a user was using this new feature, or any feature at all really, and came across some unexpected behavior, maybe like a bug in the software, they would report it to my team and we would look at it to see if it was really a bug or if it was maybe user error, potentially meaning that we needed to update the user experience of the app, or if it was maybe just some edge case that we hadn't thought of accounting for. Once we would figure out what actually had gone wrong, we would decide, okay, do we need to go ahead and try to fix it ourselves? If it was a simple change, we would fix it ourselves and push it into the code base after a code review. Otherwise, we would just work with that team who was familiar with the feature to fix the problem. Engineer support roles are not a guarantee to end up as a software engineer, but at my company, it is a proven way to become an engineer. There are still currently 4 of us working as software engineers who started out on that team, which I think is pretty cool. So if you are a junior dev out there wondering what sorts of skills will you use at your first job, I can share with you the skills that I needed in my first job as an engineer. First off is just asking questions. Ask good questions. Keep improving the questions that you're asking. Ask them to other people, ask them as you're trying to go through and debug something and just asking yourself in your head. If you're working with somebody and trying to learn something new, some new concept, ask if the person can maybe draw out what they are trying to explain to you. Ask if you can look at some concrete examples of where some concept might be currently used in the code that you're working on. Ask for help when you're stuck. Be proactive about going to find some help from your team or from some sort of mentor if you're stuck on some code. Next up, in a role like this, prioritization is huge. As I had described before, a lot of our company was using internal tools that our own engineers had built. There were maybe around 1,000 people in the same building working using those tools, and that meant a lot of people potentially reaching out to my team trying to figure out what was going wrong in this app that they were trying to use. We would do our best to try to look into everything in a very timely manner, but a lot of times the workflow would kind of ebb and flow. So when things were really crazy, it was so important that we prioritized our day, prioritized what we were working on first and what we would get to a little bit later to make sure that we were constantly being as effective as possible. One of the technical skills that I used most was writing queries. Ruby was our backend language, so we used an ORM called Active Record. Our database was a SQL database. The ORM software, or Object Relational Mapping software, allowed us to be able to make queries in the actual programming language in Ruby instead of needing to write a bunch of queries all the time in SQL. So I got really good at writing active record queries, and at some points I did need to write some SQL queries, but in general, the practice of writing these queries was a skill that I needed to use a lot. Next up, written communication. The nature of this job was to be solving problems. Problems were constantly being presented to us, but in order to solve a problem, it's really important to have a lot of context. A lot of people who were using the applications and then reporting this unexpected behavior, the potential bugs for us to investigate, didn't have an incredibly technical background. Sometimes it was really hard for them to anticipate what kind of information would be helpful to send along for this problem to get figured out. And then at the end, it was always a balance of trying to figure out how much information, how much detail to actually go into. Again, because the person that you're reporting this to may or may not have a technical background, may or may not understand how databases work and what this bug in the code actually was. So sometimes this could mean a lot of back and forth messaging, trying to understand exactly what the steps were and what the whole situation was leading to a problem, as well as some back and forth trying to explain what the issue was, or maybe this is maybe just user error and how we can try to prevent this from happening again in the future. Next up, Looking at the schemas. I hadn't previously appreciated how much context you can get from looking at the schema and understanding how the database is kind of modeled. Looking at the schema and understanding the different tables, the different objects in this object-oriented backend of ours was really the first step in me getting good enough to read through code to understand how one page led to another, led to another. Another technical skill that I used a lot was Git. We used version control at the bootcamp I went to. I had used Git in the past. We pushed things to GitHub, but I got very comfortable using Git in the first year or so on the job. That's not to say that I, even today, don't have more to learn about Git. A lot of times I look things up because I can remember, oh, I've run into this before, but I can't remember the exact command I need. So there's still a lot of looking up, but at least I have a much better understanding now. Likely on your job you will hear a lot, maybe you already have heard a lot about Git hygiene. Git is a tool for version control. So you're constantly making changes, trying to keep in mind that you might at some point need to undo your changes if you find a bad enough bug, or you might want to be able to convey to a person in the future in what order did changes happen. So I did learn a lot of strategy of Git hygiene and how to make changes in a way that would make sense for anybody needing to come back and look at my work in the future. The last skill, and it's a really important one, is grit. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that it takes a lot of grit and a lot of persistence to learn how to code when you don't have a job. And it is no different when you do have a job and are getting paid to learn how to code every day. I had someone tell me one time that I was pretty stubborn. And he meant it in a nice way, and I took it in a nice way. But that right there is grit. You have to just keep trying, even if something isn't easy. Just don't give up until you get to where you want to be. If you would like to hear some tips I have on how to really hit the ground running as soon as you start your first job in tech, check out my video right here.